Hello? Are we? Oh, okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to our first spring following lecture of our City Makers series. My name is Petra Marko. I'm the head of the Metropolitan Institute of Bratislava, and I hope and I think that many of you have been here before, but we opened Tuba, the Architecture Center, and City Planning Center in October last year, so I'm delighted that we see different faces at each event and that things are going really well for us. We've had over 50 events so far with over 2,000 participating attendees, and also on a daily basis there's lots of things happening also in the front part and exhibition and so on. You're sitting on leaflets which are gathering some feedback for us, so after you leave or at any time as you wish, we'd be really grateful if you give us feedback about your experience in this space and what we could improve. So that's really important for us. But now to the topic of City Makers today. We have the topic of co-design, and this is designing together with communities, together with the users. Why is it important? Because when we do things together and when we discuss and collaborate on things together, we need to understand everybody's needs, and that the needs might be different for different people. Can I ask please the production to close the curtain at the back, please? Yeah, thank you very much. The Metropolitan Institute, one of our teams, very important team in our institute, is leading on and dealing with participation with citizens. And I'm delighted that last year we passed the milestone of 100,000 people involved in participation directly or indirectly in projects, public space projects, building projects, different initiatives. One of our latest participation was also with the vendors and with residents in the area around the new market hall, Nova Tržnica, which also helped and led to pop-up events, including Dobry Trh, the Good Market, which is one of the initiatives looking at how we can revive this kind of very interesting building architecturally post-war building. I veered off a little bit, but we also do a lot of participation with children. We think that children are the future, and if we want to make positive change, we should bring the children along and we should give them agency to be able to impact their environment. So we've been working with over 30 primary schools through our City for Children program. Some of our colleagues from the team are here with us tonight because the topic is very relevant for us, and we'd like to learn more from our guests tonight, who are Madeleine Kessler from London, UK, and Hanna Skliarska from Nova Cvernovka in Bratislava. So first of all, I'll introduce Madeleine, and she will give a talk, a lecture, and afterwards Hanna will have a few words or a few moments to give a little bit of the local context. I think that most of you are very familiar with Nova Cvernovka and their activities, and afterwards we'll have a panel discussion, and you'll be also able to ask questions in the panel discussion. So hold your questions to the panel discussion, and now I'll tell you a little bit about Madeleine. I've known Madeleine since 2017, I believe, and Madeleine is very interesting because she's not just an architect, but she also trained as an engineer, and she's doing a lot of work around the value of design in infrastructure projects, and also talking about design and design thinking at government and governance level, which I believe is very important, because design is not just about the aesthetics or functionality, but it's also about making things better for users. So Maddie has founded her practice, Madeleine Kessler Architects, which is dedicated to designing joyful, people-centered places that contribute positively to our planet. Amongst her many accolades, she's a recipient of the RIBA Rising Star Award and Architects Journal 40 Under 40. And currently, she's a Royal Commission's Built Environment Fellow, embedding design thinking in government decision making. This is what I mentioned before. Amongst other projects, she has led and co-authored the British Pavilion at the 17th Architecture Biennale in Venice. and she's also teaching at Central St. Martin's, and she was visiting professor at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and she might tell us a little bit more about the many more things that she's doing. So a very warm welcome, Madeleine, to Bratislava, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. It's brilliant to be here. Thank you all for coming. I've had a brilliant few days exploring your amazing city. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about the power of co-design, a subject that's really close to my heart. As Petra mentioned, I'm an architect and engineer by training, and over the sort of past 10-15 years I've been working across architecture, curation and urbanism. And I'm really interested in architecture as this conversation about the city at every scale, looking at sort of working with people to really understand the place that they live in. You know, no one knows a place like the people that live there. And through sort of co-design activities together, testing those spaces to then inform spatial practice and architecture and built projects. And then using that as a way to inform urban governance and systems. So sort of everything's kind of feeding into a loop at these different scales. And that all really goes back to when I was studying as a student sort of 15 years ago now. And I was really interested in the architect's role in the evolving city. So it's really important that cities continue to evolve. You know, that they don't fall stagnant. You see it all over Bratislava, like the importance of, as the context that we're living in changes, as the climate changes, that we sort of evolve our cities. But as architects, by sort of helping sort of evolve a city, we're also often complicit in that city's destruction. And so I was really interested in how, as an architect, you can navigate this kind of boundary between the evolution and destruction of a city. And that's where I think co-design is really interesting and helpful, because I think a lot of it's about involving people and also thinking about the city as something that's operating at different scales. So at the scale of the person, at the scale of a neighbourhood, the scale of a system. And when thinking about cities, I often return to the Ray and Charles Eames Powers of 10. Hopefully, I don't know if you're familiar with the video, but you can Google it afterwards, it's on YouTube. But it's this incredible video they made in the 70s, sort of starting at a picnic, and then it zooms out every 10 seconds by a scale of 10 until you get to the universe, and then it scales back in until you're at the scale of like an atom. Or a molecule. And I think it really kind of reminds us that everything we're doing is connected and part of these different scales. And at the same time, sort of looking at people like Sherry Arnstein, who came up the ladder of participation in 1969. And this really, I think, is important, especially in the conversation about co-design, because I think co-design, especially right now, it's become quite a trendy topic, which is often used in quite a tokenistic way. Often you get sort of developers or people coming along, sort of tick boxing consultation, doing consultation just through questionnaires or something, but then not really doing anything with the answers. But that's just a tick box that they've consulted people. And I think this ladder of participation really helps to remind us that we need to really be kind of aiming to be towards the top of this. So we're really looking at working in partnership with communities to really allow that kind of citizens' control and citizens' power. Sorry, the slides are a little bit slow. And I suppose all of that's kind of that's all sort of informed my own methodology, which is all around participation at those different scales that I've been talking about, and really looking at listening to people and communities, learning from those conversations, and then acting upon what it is that we learn. And I think something that's really important, I've just seen the participatory design slip, as I'm working across these different kind of scales of spatial practice, urban governance and knowledge exchange through participatory design, is collaboration. I think, increasingly in our societies, right now everyone's sort of becoming much more segregated and in these silos, and that's both in professional silos but also in the way we're living. And I think it's really important that we're collaborating more between our different kind of professions, different groups of people, different communities, and I think by doing that we can then start to inform different projects, and that's sort of the way that I work as an architect. I almost see my role more as like a facilitator of bringing different groups together than sort of coming along and just designing something. And so, I guess, the question I really wanted to ask through this presentation is, at this time that we're living in, where the decisions about the future of our cities, they're often made through these really fragmented and opaque processes that we as citizens aren't a part of. And so are there these opportunities for co-design to bring different groups together and really reclaim the city as a collective project? And I'm going to do that by taking you through the different scales of co-design that I've kind of been working at. So starting at the community scale, then the neighbourhood scale, and then the system scale. So starting at the community scale, I work a lot with sort of underrepresented groups and marginalised groups. At the moment, working on a project with the NHS, for example, with victims of trauma. And this is a public kitchen, which is a project I've been working on for the past 2 years with asylum seekers and refugees. And so the project started as a collaboration with the London Borough of Camden and UCL's Global Institute for Prosperity. And they both sort of had a shared interest around asylum seekers and refugees and food poverty. So often refugees, when they come over to a new country, one of the few, they can't take very many things. Often one of the things they bring is seeds to plant for food. And at the same time, in the UK and I think elsewhere, that refugees are often housed in temporary accommodation that has no access to kitchens or food spaces. And people can be in this accommodation for anything from a few weeks to a few years. And it can become really problematic, sort of mentally especially, that you haven't got a space to sort of invite people over to cook, to make meals for yourself nutritionally. And so we were looking at how we could bring a group of refugees and asylum seekers together to create food infrastructure across Camden. And so we started off through this code briefing process to understand the food memories of this group of refugees. Now I have to say, all the photos I've had to be quite selective of, because obviously it's a very difficult topic, and I've got to be careful of people's faces I show, but I'm going to try and show you best I can this project. But essentially we started off with these food memories that people had of where they are from, and then created these collages to look at the kinds of spaces that they would like to see and they were missing in their community, and the sort of spaces we could start to create. And at that point we started to realise it would be useful to have a sort of physical space for us to intervene and test out some of these ideas. And we brought in a new partner, which was Somerstown Community Association, which was it's a community centre in Camden, in quite a deprived area, and they had like a lot of space, but the spaces weren't very well used, and a lot of them were closed. And so we were looking at maybe we could take their kitchen space, for example, and create a kind of food space for not only asylum seekers or refugees to use, but also members of a local community. And so we started to do these workshops where we were taking physical bits of tape and trying to understand what the potential was for this space, to get rid of things, to add new elements, and also to the facade, like how we can make the facade more welcoming and open it up to the local community. And using chalk and things like that to understand where there were kind of spatial opportunities. And then myself and my friend Chris, who are architects, we started to translate those ideas into a plan as people are talking about it to us, because I think that's where our skills as architects could sort of start to come in, is the fact that we could translate this into something that potentially could be realised. And so we came up with this concept which we spoke to Camden about, and they were quite excited by, where we'd sort of grow things up the wall. We'd open up the bars off the windows and put these new shutters in, have some new seating outside, and also do up the cafe inside. But inevitably, one of the issues that came about at this point was budgets. And we started to realise that we need to phase the different elements in order to be able to spend the budget in the kind of government cycles required, and also fundraise for more bits. So at this point we brought in more kind of participants, so we also brought in local residents to help us realise elements, community organisers, Feast with Us, who sort of helped to programme the space, and sort of bring the refugees together to teach them to cook different recipes, but also learn from them recipes from home. And the project just sort of started to grow more and more organically. And at this point we did another co-design workshop where we were looking at specific elements like a drinking fountain, benches, a mural, to understand what these could be and sort of design them together. And then we did 2 workshops where we were building these elements together. So these are the tiles that we started to create for the entrance mural. And it was quite a nice moment when the mayor of Camden, the guy here, he came along because it turned out he was also a refugee himself, so he was really interested in the project. And it just sort of became this real kind of festival almost for the day where we were all making things. And it was amazing because it really brought the local community together with these asylum seekers and refugees, and normally they're kind of set up against one another. And it was one of the first times, I think, that people were kind of talking to one another, and the act of kind of making things together started to get completely different conversations going. And so we were also making a bench together. So this is the bench that now sits outside the community centre as part of the first phase, which you can see people have carved in their sort of favourite foods. And then this kind of tiled mural element, which makes this entrance much more welcoming. And now the next phase of the project we're working on is the signage, which is being installed in the summer, and taking these bars off the window, which we've also got funding for. So I think the really interesting thing about this project is it's these really small elements which start to change this building. The process of doing that is bringing different groups together, but it's a very kind of slow urbanism, a very kind of slow process. It's taken a few years just to get this far, and I think it will take a few more to really realise the full potential of this project. So the next scale I wanted to talk about is the neighbourhood scale. And for this scale, I'm going to take you through a project called Filling the Void. This is a project that I ran as a design studio in Karlsruhe when I was a visiting professor there. And it was all about the death and life of the great European high street. So it was looking at high streets as these kind of central spines to towns and cities across both the UK and Europe. High Street in the UK is the most common name of a street. Like pretty much every town and city, well, every town and city does have a high street. And that used to be the kind of main kind of thoroughfare of every street. And they came about following the Great Fire in 1666. So following the Great Fire of London, there was sort of these kind of reforms, planning reforms, which designated these 4 different street types, and shops were only permitted after that on high streets. And then in the sort of Victorian era, in the 19th century, they became this kind of golden era where you go to high streets to shop, but you'd also go there to be seen and like promenade. But then in the 20th century, there's been this huge decline, partly due to online shopping, COVID as well, saw a huge decline. And they're a real problem because they are like at the centre of towns and cities, and this space has this huge opportunity to bring lots of different people together, but instead are these huge voids. I've been working with an artist in Bournemouth over the past few years, so looking at Bournemouth High Street, and we've been looking at opportunities to open up art spaces. So this is one of our proposals for a former department store to become a kind of art space for the local community, and test out the potential for cultural uses along high streets. He opened up Bournemouth's first ever art gallery within an old derelict department store called Bobby's, and it was incredible because it just brought like members of the community together who were all interested in art for the first time. And you know, people were there just being like, I didn't know anyone else in the city was also an artist or interested in art. And it sort of reminds me potentially of this space a bit as well, like the importance of having a space for people to come and go and get to know one another. And it really proved that this model of bringing culture to high streets can work. And so we're slowly managing to get people to invest now in doing this in other buildings. But back to Karlsruhe in Germany. So it has a very similar kind of trajectory to the typical British high streets, the typical German high streets. Obviously, I'm not so familiar with Slovakia, but I'm imagining this is a similar issue here because it's an issue all over Europe, where once these were real buzz places and now you're just full of empty shops. In Karlsruhe, there's an additional issue that the tram was rerouted underground, so they pedestrianised the high street in an effort to try and get more people there. But in fact, the opposite's happened, because now you don't get people sort of going through on a tram, accidentally coming off a tram, you know, like seeing, oh, maybe I'll come off and go to that shop. Instead, they very purposefully just go under the high streets, and you've just got very little kind of footfall coming down. So the students, they did a series of kind of participatory projects along the high streets, where they were bringing different members of the community together to understand what they'd like to see on the high street, you know, what the opportunity really is for their high streets and these abandoned shops. And actually just the abandoned street itself, because the street itself is quite a wide street with really not much going on, and are there opportunities to create interventions that kind of slow people down, spark their imagination, allow them to bump into one another and just get to know their neighbours, rather than just always walking past each other. And so we staged like a review there, so they printed off their ideas for what the high street could become, so that passers-by could start to understand them, and just posted them up on sort of abandoned shop windows, and also created this installation which was up for I think three or 4 days, and the installation sort of evolved and transformed into different things and different activities over the course of those few days. But importantly, it sort of became this forum for a discussion, and that brought together city planners, people from the university, architects, people from the local community. Anyone who was just walking along past this installation could also join in, and that started this conversation of why aren't more things like this happening, because everyone was really enjoying it. And that's actually since led to a relaxation in some of the kind of red tape and planning within Karlsruhe. And I think it really shows how testing things on a small scale can start to lead to a bigger scale change. This is quite a nice video I'd like to show, because it just sort of shows the activity that was going on. Just turn the music off while I play it. Oh God. But yeah, like the central table sort of changed over the course of the day. And it was just like a real celebration of what the high street could become. Sorry. And yeah, I think you know, all these installations are now being reappropriated by a local kind of cultural centre there, and they bring them out into different spaces now at different times of year. And as I said, it also has led to this relaxation in planning policy, which has allowed more installations for this like this to now happen. And then going up to the next scale of systems, and so this is one that I'm particularly interested in, as Petra mentioned. Like my work at the moment, especially with this fellowship I have, is really about trying to embed co-design and design in general into government decision making, and looking at how we can really transform systems like government policy by embedding design into it. And I wanted to start by showing you this project called More Not Less. So originally we were approached for this competition to look at temporary accommodation. And so temporary accommodation unfortunately, it's always going to be necessary. It's almost like emergency accommodation, not just for like refugees and asylum seekers, but if someone's home burns down, or for some reason they're kicked out of their house, temporary accommodation can at least still be there. But the problem with it is it's often not temporary, and people are in it for many years. And in the UK, there's no planning regulations around temporary accommodation, so it goes through a planning class called sui generis, which means that it can be built to any standards. And what we found is you get some really horrific temporary accommodation going up, because it's just squeezed to the smallest minimum space standard you can imagine. And I think as we were doing the work into researching sort of what was going up in terms of temporary accommodation, we started to realise, as an architect, by the time you get that project, it's far too late, because your hands are almost tied. And actually the issue is much higher up the chain, and we needed to get some kind of design standards. And so in the team, we were bringing together people with lived experience of temporary accommodation, people who had who were psychologists, people who were play specialists, to really understand what those design standards should be for temporary accommodation for it to work. And this is a video that we made.
Are you sitting comfortably right now? Then I'll begin. Imagine no broadcasting standards existed in TV or cinema. You might be forced to watch me like this, or to watch through this tiny screen. That would be annoying. Now imagine how a lack of standards could affect not just your media, but also where you live. There are some standards. A family home needs to be 86 square metres, about 17 per person. A one-bedroom flat needs to be 50 square metres. Even free-range chickens get at least 4 square metres. But temporary accommodation, where you end up when you're homeless, has no minimum standard. That means some families are living in as little as this. Anyone can end up here. This is Charlie.
Homelessness affected me as a child because there's just a deep sense of difference. I was using a potty until the age of 8 in the room that I lived, slept and studied.
More than 120,000 children are homeless and living in temporary accommodation in the UK. They can spend years of their lives here. Damp, lack of play and outside space are common problems. Without standards, that won't change. More, not less, is a design code to set the right standards. Enough space to do your homework, enough space to play, enough space to eat together. This is better housing. This is a better quality of life. Now, imagine that world.
This would have a massive impact. I've seen how traumatised our children are by poor temporary accommodation. Imagine what their lives would be like if they were safe, happy and proud of where they lived.
The design code is here, the economics stack up, but a policy change is needed. More, not less.
I think the really interesting thing with this is that we could then take this video that we've made to politicians to start this conversation about getting design standards for temporary accommodation, and that conversation is now ongoing. And the making of this project, it brought together my friend Ashi, who was presenting, who I was at school with, who had lived in temporary accommodation the whole time we were growing up, that none of us knew about, but she's now a broadcaster, and so she could bring those broadcasting skills to this conversation. And we had a filmmaker bringing his skills and helping us to come up with what these standards should be. We had people of all different backgrounds, and that kind of participation of bringing people together with these different skill sets, I think, helped us to create quite a powerful kind of impactful message about why this needs to change, which is being listened to. Whereas I think as a sole architect, I would never have been able to sort of do that by myself. I would only be able to communicate through drawing. And so I think it's interesting thinking about in participatory design how we bring different skill sets together. And I've also been working a lot with the National Infrastructure Commission's design group over the past few years. So I know Petra through the National Infrastructure Commission, Young Professionals panel we're on. And through that work, we launched some design principles for national infrastructure. So these are the UK's first ever design principles for national infrastructure. But what we realised was they were adopted quite quickly by policy, but they weren't necessarily being actually used on projects. So I brought together these different kind of institutions through a design symposium to try and understand what the root issues of why these weren't being used were. And that was a really interesting process because I learned at that point how important it was to tailor the language that you're using to different kind of bodies. So for example, the Global Infrastructure Investment Association, they invest in all the infrastructure globally. And when I first approached them, they had absolutely no interest in design. They were just like, I don't know why you're talking to us. This isn't our thing. And then as soon as it sort of started to change the language to ESG goals and targets, they suddenly became interested in this conversation. And it was a very interesting way to bring together these different bodies through the symposium, and through that we realised we needed to produce some project level design principles which have now been launched. And through these sort of give much, I guess much more kind of steer as to what we meant by design principles. And this is now informing my work with the fellowship called the First 100 Days, where I'm really looking at how to embed design into the first 100 days of infrastructure projects. So yeah, I guess going up to that systemic kind of government scale, looking at how we can start to really champion design and embed that by bringing different groups together. And then the final project I wanted to talk about was the Garden of Privatised Delights, which is the British Pavilion for the Venice Biennale, and I think sort of quite nicely ties all these different scales together. So this was a project I co-curated with Madeleine Kessler for the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago. There's a film here I'm going to play to give you an introduction.
The Garden of Privatised Delights is exploring the issue of privatised public space across the UK and looking at how those spaces can be opened up to be better used, owned and accessed by everyone.
Our exhibition is inspired by a painting by Hieronymus Bosch called The Garden of Earthly Delights.
We use that to make our own version of the painting, and that looks at the kind of middle ground of privatised public space between the kind of utopia of the commons on the left and then the dystopia of total privatisation.
And that's the middle ground that you're stepping into as you step into our exhibition.
The idea for the pavilion actually came out of a summer school that Maddie and I taught at the Architectural Association back in 2015. And we were really interested in the pub as a positive example of privatised public space, as a place where people can come together and debate different ideas. We were really excited about this because the pub was often the place where we brainstormed these ideas and came up with them.
We became really interested in this network of privatised public spaces which sort of dominate our cities and our towns today. We invited teams of designers, architects and researchers to then delve more into those topics and design an installation.
And it was a really great opportunity to think of the pavilion as a platform to unify all the different research that was happening around this topic.
We've taken 4 different typologies of privatised public spaces across the UK and reimagined these across 4 of the rooms in the pavilion, and those of Garden Square, the pub, the High Street and the Youth Centre. And then we've overlaid these with 2 government ministries advocating for more bottom-up approaches to land ownership and ownership of data. And then there's also a surprise 7th room, which is the public toilet in the basement of the British Pavilion.
I think the exhibition is really designed as a big testing ground so that we can learn from how visitors use and understand the spaces.
The entire exhibition is designed to be an immersive experience, an immersive installation that we absolutely want people to interact with and climb on. It's been designed as a space to experience.
Jane Jacobs was someone we quoted in our original competition entry, and she said that cities should be something for everybody only when and only because they're designed by everybody.
So the exhibition is giving the visitor the tools and the agency to understand how they can start to take ownership of their own spaces and lands. If there's a piece of land near you that you'd like to start to utilise and make work harder for your community, you know, how do you actually go about and start doing that? The Garden of Privatised Delights is really advocating for cities that are welcoming to everyone.
Equal spaces that are more open, more green, more inhabited, more used, and where everyone felt a sense of ownership over them. One of the things we really like audiences to take away is that all public spaces have the opportunity to be opened up and used in different ways, and that there are strategies that are explored by us and our team in the pavilion that could be adapted to kind of any public space, whether it's in the UK or in another country.
We hope they walk away feeling hopeful and understanding that we are all part of the solution. If we come together as communities, as architects, as landowners, as government policy makers, that's when we can start to make really meaningful change.
It's actually to get people to question like kind of who owns their public space, what's possible there, who do you speak to if you want to do something different.
We want all spaces in our city to be gardens of delight. So the project's all about privatised public space. We started with this painting by Hieronymus Posch called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And that's kind of inspired the whole exhibition. So we started by uninhabiting the painting, and then we re-inhabited it with our version of privatised public space. We were looking at the utopia of the commons on the left, the dystopia of total privatisation on the right, and then this kind of middle ground that we all actually live in. And we wanted to sort of take the opportunity to really delve into that middle ground, because often this conversation around privatised public space is really set up as good versus evil, like black versus white. But we were trying to say, actually, it exists everywhere, and there are ways to be able to open it up to the public. And so how do we as architects sort of navigate that middle ground? And this collage became a really useful tool in bringing together different kind of stakeholders around that conversation, because in the kind of evolution of this project, we were bringing so many different people together from different backgrounds, from community groups to developers, you know, who all need to be part of this conversation, because without everyone as part of this, you sort of get very extreme things happening in the city. So we were researching, you know, the issues of privatised public space. In England and Wales, it's incredibly opaque who owns the land that you're walking across. So obviously, often you don't actually know that you're sort of breaking the rules, and then it's private land until you've broken the rules. There's this project called Who Owns England. It's also a website by Guy Shrubsole and Anna Powell-Smith, and they've documented all the kind of records from the land registry. And what they found is sort of everything you see in red is undocumented. So someone owns that land, but it's not clear to the public who actually owns it. And so it's really problematic if you want to do something with a piece of land and you don't even know who to approach, like who even owns that land. So we're starting to look at how we can create greater transparency. And this is from the Occupy protests, sort of about 10-15 years ago now in London, where originally the protesters, they were protesting on what looked like public space, but it was actually privately owned by the Mitsubishi Estate Company. And so they're sort of ushered on off this piece of private land because you're not allowed to protest there. And I think it just starts to show how scary it can be that you don't actually know the rules and regulations around what seems like public space in your cities. And through this project, we were lucky enough to engage with the Greater London Authority on things like the Public London Charter. So this is the first ever public space charter, looking at what all kind of public space, whether it's privately or publicly owned, should allow. So things like, it should be free of charge, it has to be transparent, open, and this has now become part of the GLA's policy. If I take you, I'm going to just quickly take you through the pavilion as well, just about the different installations. So as you approach the pavilion, you're sort of stepping into that middle ground. You sort of immediately are confronted by these railings, which are setting up the issue of privatised public space, that it's often only accessible to those with a key. You couldn't go straight into the garden, you had to go around the entire pavilion until you found yourself back inside. So the first room you sort of went into was Publicani by the decorators, so they invited different sort of designers and researchers to help design all the installations. And this was really looking at whether the pub could be a place that's not just for drinking, but also a versatile centre for civic action. So it was looking at the importance of pubs in the UK, particularly in sort of smaller towns and villages, where the pub is a heart of a community, but they're shutting down, and where you see a high rate of pub closures, you actually often see an increase in alcoholism. So it was looking at how could we rethink the pub so that it can be sustainable, and they were sort of embedding different bits of infrastructure like a letterbox and plug sockets, and sort of rethinking how the pub could start to operate. And then you went into the Ministry of Collective Data, which was looking at facial recognition technology, and not just like, it's very problematic how it's being used at the moment, but whether there are actually opportunities for it to be used in ways that could be beneficial to the public, for example, allowing you to protest somewhere without being physically present. And then into the high street, which was looking at how high streets, they're more than just commercial centres, they're also social centres. So, for example, when you get your hair cut, you're not just getting a haircut, but you're also getting a conversation with someone. And in these cones, they sort of played conversations from Sheffield high streets with people. This furniture was all made through sort of co-design workshops. The ATM, instead of dispensing money, it dispensed pieces of advice from an economist. And yeah, just really starting to look at how we can sort of share our spaces, how we can sort of rethink the high streets in different ways. And then into the Ministry of Common Land by Public Works, which was looking at bottom-up approaches to land ownership. It had this incredible sort of photo that they'd done. So this was a full-day photo shoot, bringing together everyone who'd been involved in the project through different, because I think what's really interesting about Public Works is they do a lot of community consultation work, but when they document it, they realised it looks so dull. Even though you might have had the most interesting conversation, it just looks like a load of people sitting around a table with a coffee. So how do you actually bring those conversations to life? And so they've started what they call situated images, where they stage with like a theatre director and a photographer. They'll spend a whole day staging what came out of the conversation, so that you can then photograph that and bring that to life, and then entice other people into the conversations about what's happening around their community and their land, and the importance of that kind of communication and starting to engage more and more people. And then looking at spaces for teenagers in the city. So often the spaces that are provided for teenagers, either they're completely missing or they're for very active teenagers, like basketball courts. And VPPR were working with a social anthropologist to understand what spaces teenagers would actually like to see in the city that they could use. Often when teenagers are hanging around, they're sort of seen as a problem and sort of ushered on, and one of the few places they can go to is like a shopping centre. So it was really interesting because they interviewed teenagers from up and down the country, from all kind of parts of society, and again, what they found was the only place that teenagers felt welcome in was like their bedroom. But they really wanted access to the city in different ways, just to sit with friends and chill. So they created this installation based on the kind of forms from that painting, which people could just sort of lie in at the top, but also worked with a playground designer. So the rungs are spaced too high apart for a small child to climb up. It has to be someone of a certain height, and played these conversations with teenagers and young people around the installation. And then finally you found yourself back inside the Garden of Delights, and this was really looking at how we could open up inaccessible green spaces in the city. So in London and other cities around the UK, you get a lot of garden squares which are surrounded by these railings, and they're only accessible to those with a key. But more often than not, they're just completely empty because the buildings surrounding them are no longer residential. And so either no one really has a key, or the people who have a key never use it, yet you've got all sorts of people who don't have any access to outdoor space. So we're looking at how we can start to open up those spaces. We were talking a lot to landowners and different people who own those garden squares to understand how we can start to test them and open them up, and they are starting to now do that. Interestingly, in World War II, a lot of the railings around those garden squares were melted. They were taken down and melted to be used as ammunition. And you get all these amazing texts from around that time from people like George Orwell talking about how they could suddenly meet different people in these garden squares for the first time and grow things. But after the war, they then just reinstated the railings. So we were looking at how we could start to transform and change that. And then finally we looked at the public toilet, because this sort of came about as we were working on the project. Actually, we realised the toilets in the British Pavilion are a real hype of activity and this huge social space, because no other pavilion has toilets. When we were out there for the deinstall of the Art Biennale, we suddenly realised the importance of the public toilet. Both as a space actually for a very necessary space for people to use, but also interestingly how it became this kind of social hive of activity and space. And so we wanted to open up the toilets for the public to be able to use in the Biennale. And through a series of very difficult conversations, we managed to finally convince the British Council this was a good idea, because they were quite embarrassed by the toilets. But then La Biennale sort of stepped in and said, your toilets don't actually meet Italian building regulations. So instead we had to just put them on display, but a nice legacy of the project is that the toilets have now been done up and they are now accessible, so it's quite a nice legacy. Then as part of the project we created a catalogue, but we decided to create this kind of manual for reclaiming public space. We wanted to make a manual that would allow the public to really take ownership and shape their public space. I've got a copy here for you, all to keep it to you, BA, so you can have a look at that later. And also something I think I just wanted to briefly mention that came out of this project was we were doing this in the COVID years, which was very interesting. But a sort of silver lining was that we got to know the other curators really well, because the Biennale was postponed by a year. And we started something called the Curators Collective, which initially started as a sort of self-help group, like who else is having issues with shipping, or we were also having issues with Brexit, and how could we sort of help one another out. But slowly, actually quite quickly evolved, where we were starting to talk about what each of our pavilions were really exploring and understanding the overlaps between those conversations, because often at Venice, everyone's so kind of intensely focused on their own pavilion, those kind of international conversations actually don't happen. And so out of that we set up a series of talks and discussions. We did a project called A Bench in Venice, where we catalogued all the unused material from our different pavilions, put that out to a competition for students to create benches around the Giardini. And this is something which has continued, so we now are continuing those kind of discussions and forums and collaborations. And I think it just goes to show the different collaborations that can come out of projects in completely unexpected ways, and to always kind of be open to what might happen. But back to the Garden of Privatised Delights. For me, I think the thing I'm most proud of is the afterlife. So we managed to bring the pavilion back to the UK. It became the first pavilion to be brought back to the UK in its entirety, and then in the UK it could be put on display for free for anyone to come and see in this kind of high streets space. It was really difficult to do because it was a mid-Brexit, and half the pavilion had gone out before Brexit, half after Brexit. It was an absolute nightmare. But we managed to make it happen. And there it could become this real space for discussion and conversation and looking at how we could start to change planning policy. So we had these events, for example, this is Sian Berry, who at the time was the leader of the Green Party, and she just brought out something called the toilet paper, and we had this whole discussion where we brought developers together with her about how we could open up more public toilets. And it was really interesting because the developer said that he was a developer from King's Cross, and he could put a number on how valuable public toilets had been to him in that development. And he started to realise that actually things like the public toilets, they could speak to different people in different ways, and we could start to see more of these by speaking that different language. The building centre, they then also, we managed to sort of open up their accessible public toilet for the public. And it was just amazing to start to see the installations being taken on by the public in new ways for different forums and discussions. And I think at that point it's kind of like the ultimate, that's what we always wanted to happen. We didn't want it to be this kind of exhibition. It was very kind of controlled in how it was used. It was for the public to start to take ownership of. And since then, the pavilion, it started to kind of pop up in new places, because we worked very hard to make sure each installation went on somewhere. So this was the playground, which we put up first outside the building centre. We gave it to an adventure playground, but since then I keep getting photos from people of it popping up at places like Glastonbury, and it's just really amazing to see this project kind of go off on its own life without us involved almost. And yeah, I think ultimately for me it's the discussions that have come out of this project which I'm most proud of, and I think have really shown how important physical space can be in bringing different people together, in testing ideas, how people are part of the conversation in creating that space, but also making sure that we use that space as an opportunity to continue those conversations so that things really happen. And I just wanted to end on this quote by Jane Jacobs, which I think has really inspired not only the British Pavilion, but I think it goes back to when I was studying like all the work that I do, because I just think it's so true that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they're created by everybody. And I think that really brings back all those different scales together as well that I'm talking about. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Maddie, for this amazing talk, which has touched, I think, on so many important points that we are dealing with as citizens here in Bratislava, in the society, but also globally. I'd like to ask Hannah now, who's a sociologist and facilitator, collaborating with Nova Cvetnovka, and she helped co-create its strategy, which won the 2025 Social Mary Award for Social Innovation. So it's really interesting because Maddie is talking about co-design through actually making things and designing physical space. But Hannah is coming from a perspective of actually designing the process of co-design and collaboration and participation and connecting communities with the space. So Hannah, the stage is yours for, hold on, I should have switched this. So now you can see Hannah, she's also here in person. But yeah, give us a little bit of a local perspective. I think there's just one.
Hello. Okay. Hello, I'm Hannah. You know my face now. From quite close perspective. But I'm coming from Nova Cvetnovka. You can see in this picture just a very tiny part of it. We have 20,000 meters squares, and we are taking care of 2 buildings and a huge park and 400 people coming in and out every day. Chicken, kids, different animals all around. I also think that humans are animals sometimes in this space. We have a bar, kindergarten, we have a gym, we have a school, we have co-housing, we have studios and cultural center. And and definitely many more things around. But why I'm saying is that I think is the ecosystem, that it's so complex and so huge that we can talk about it like it's a small city. I sometimes call it a village, also with all of the relations that are happening there, and also like when you go in the 5 minutes you can find almost everything. Chickens, okay? We have real chickens there. And why I'm standing here, I think, is that when I come to Nova Cvernovka almost 3.5 years ago, I was a neutral facilitator. I was there to listen for 1 year, and I designed the whole process in a way that I have to understand, that I cannot help with the strategy or to help you to grow or to change if I don't understand it from the perspective of the neutral sociologist, facilitator, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately the picture is not here, but I think that one of the pictures I found that showed my naive dreams of participation is that when I came I had this feeling that when I do huge one day, the assembly, everyone will come, we'll do activities, workshops, we'll talk, we'll have a beer afterwards, it's gonna be nice. No one came. Even though we made a huge marketing around it, we asked people to come. I think only one person that came sits here. She's always all around the place. Hello, Angie. The only true believer. But the next picture I wanted to show you was the assembly that happened last year in September, when there were like 30 people after 3 years. And for me, the point with participation is after 3 years, I can say I hate it, really. I had it like when I was tipsy one night, I came to my office and I wrote, I hate participation. But at the same time, I truly believe it's so important, but it takes so much time and energy. And I think we can talk about it later during the discussion.
All right, so let's get discussing, and because the time is running away, I'm just going to give one question to the panel, and then I'll open up to the audience so that you can ask your questions. And it kind of inspired me at the beginning and the end also, because Maddie talked about, you know, from the scale of the cell to the universe, and then Hannah talked about, you know, the Nova Cvernovka as being a city or a village or a system. So we're talking about these systems, and I would like to ask you both whether co-design can strengthen democracy and democratic culture, because I think that globally around the world has a democracy crisis, and how can co-design and participation help, or can it be hell and unhelpful in some ways? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it can be incredibly helpful. I think at the moment you've got, well, yeah, a democracy crisis is the word for it, but you've got a lot of people who are very disillusioned. You've also got like everything's so segregated and set up against one another. And I think there's a real opportunity with co-design. I always feel like through the activities that you're doing, you get very different conversations with people. It breaks down barriers. It can bring different groups together, different generations together. And you can start to see that actually we all want something very similar, which is a better world to live in. And so you can use it as a way to start to align those visions and align those kind of strategies. But I very much agree with Hannah, it can be incredibly painful as a process. And so it requires like real patience and persistence. And I think, yeah, a real genuine kind of like, people making it happen and going through those tough times. But I think if we could get that embedded, in government, it would really help.
And in a way, I mean, in former Czechoslovakia or in Slovakia now, it's still a new process. We've had 36 years at it, which is quite still young democracy. So Hannah, your thoughts on democracy?
For me, it's hard to talk about the democracy in our space, you know, like, but I would just want maybe to point out that what is the base of democracy, you know, is that the trust. For example, I trust my government, I trust my institution, I trust people that I live next to, and that trust to each other is very hard to build. Yeah? And when we think about it, that democracy is built only on the people that you know, we can trust also, like, to decide on something. And now I come to the point is that as an institution, for example, as a person that is running the place, you know, sometimes I catch myself if I trust people that they can decide, or if I trust their biases in the space, yeah? Or me myself, even though I'm very open, I'm trained mediator, is that how I can even talk to these people when they do not understand me as a running body of 20,000 meter squares, and this now what is hard for me is to find this ground for us to talk and build that trust. And I don't think it goes only through the workshops, talking, you know, and discussions. Just doesn't work like that. It's naive Hannah 3 years ago. But I think democracy also in our homes happen when we meet in the pub, when we meet in the garden, when we help that old lady next door. That's where democracy starts for me. And this is what in my mind I changed when I started to think about the participation in Nova Cvernovka, is that I have to help people and myself to talk to each other in everyday life, and then start to talk about the participative budgeting and so on. You know, it just doesn't make sense without the core trust between each other.
That's absolutely true, and it sort of brings me back to the commons. And if we don't have enough commons or common spaces where we can meet and bounce off each other, and you know, like the example with the hair salon and those informal conversations. So the topic of the privatization also of, or you know, whose space it is, and the idea of this extended living room. For me, the Freedom Square in Bratislava is a very good example where it has become this really democratic space. It's a space for a protest, it's a space for a picnic, it's open, it's barrier-free and accessible, and it's a confident city which, and city leadership which kind of opens up public space in such democratic ways. So again, kind of coming to the spatial aspects. Have we got any questions from the audience? Because I could go on and ask something, but have we got someone who would like to ask our...
Can I really quickly add
yes.
something to that? I think that's really interesting, because I think increasingly our cities are designed as like more lonely places, because everything's become so efficient how things are built, and those opportunities just bump into one another to get to know your neighbours. Those are the spaces that are really missing, and I think that those spaces also help build that community. So yeah, it was really interesting what they said.
Maybe just to react, to make it more like the conversation, is that maybe just a funny example, and what do you think about it? That we have these spaces that we decided that, okay, let it go. We don't have to, you know, we don't have to owe everything, you know, or we don't have to as an expert, an architect, you know. We don't have to really like model it, but just leave it for the people.
Yeah.
And we have this garden, with the chicken, and with the rabbits and everything. And in one moment it happened that it didn't have its owner. There was no one to take care of it as one person from foundation. But what happened is that there is an old lady, Janka, I love her so much, and she just came and couldn't find anyone. Yeah, like, can I take this part of the garden? And she just started to work there. And actually, last week she told me, you know what, I was working there for 3 years. I was taking care of the whole garden, and I didn't know who that Juraj is or who is the person I can talk to, but what was amazing is that I could just do it. Yeah, and it's like, it comes like maybe the question, you know, is this the participation, or is this allowance, you know, for people to be part of something without discussion? Yeah, or
is it the middle ground?
Yeah.
I found that was very interesting, the middle ground argument, maybe, that you had with, you know, like, we're not talking about let's not have any private spaces or privately owned and managed spaces. They could be also very, very useful. But the two extremes aren't working.
Yeah. I think exactly, and I think all too often it's just such a polarized debate or discussion. But like you're saying, it's very murky. And we don't almost have the language of how to kind of describe how these organic processes can happen. So how do we therefore set up the frameworks people to be able to take ownership over their space in different ways. And that's almost the interesting thing. And I think as an architect, when you're looking at it spatially, it's how do you make sure you're not designing something that's so prescriptive it can only be used in one way, but so flexible that it becomes used for nothing. So it's how do you sort of create these frameworks that allow people to know that they're allowed to do that and allow them to manage that. 'Cause imagine if you had more people who felt they could start doing that.
During the presentation, actually, I was really thinking about like how to make the more yankas.
Yeah, how do you allow more of that to happen?
Yes. And I think you just said it, is that to create the basic structures,
Yeah, like
and
the
just
infrastructure.
the infrastructure, to feel safe there, okay, there are the pods, okay, it's opened, as you said. But then my question is like how do you have to organize it, you know? How much money and resources you should put into it, or the part of the participation is like, take it, leave it, die. Yeah, like, I don't care, now it's yours, you know? And this is actually the dilemma that I'm working with in most of the spaces that we use.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well, because co-design, I think it can sometimes be quite exploitative if you're not careful. Like, it really relies on communities to give up a lot of time for free. And therefore, how do you make sure people are always somehow getting something back for it as well, in exchange for their time? I think, how do you allow more yankers to exist from different backgrounds, different age groups? And how do you allow people as well to know that it is happening? These are all questions I don't have an answer for, but I think are questions we need to be asking one another, and we need to be testing, because I don't think there's one solution. I think it's about a series of different kind of ways of working and solutions, and being more aware of the need for this to happen, and I guess the time and energy that goes into making sure it does happen as well, and appreciating that.
I'd like to ask you both about how to resolve conflicts in participation and co-design, because in our institute, participation is a big part of it, as I mentioned, and it's a learning curve, and I mentioned, we are a young democracy, so in your different experiences, I mean, there's always, I mentioned, some tension, some conflict, or even there's apathy at the beginning, as Hannah mentioned, like nobody shows up. I mean, we've had just a couple of weeks ago a visit from Prague, from the Institute of Planning from Prague, and they were talking about their metropolitan plan and the process of participation, and they had designed this perfect participation process and set out and made an invitation to the first meeting, and there were like 3 people sitting on the steps, and then there were like 8 people from their institute with like a big display of everything and ready to interact. So how do we first of all get people in the room, and then how do we resolve conflict once we have them in the room and they will not agree? I mean, by default, most of the time they will not 100% agree.
I will maybe start with the first one, how to get people in the room. I don't know. But I think it's patience. I like it wait for 3 years, and you cannot stop doing it. It's like the basic social theory is telling you that you have to create ritualized activities. And then people will just get used to that, build the trust, understand the language, and so on. I don't want to talk about the social theories anymore, but I think you cannot just, after 2 years, we could say that, I just wanted to curse, just leave it be, okay? And we are not doing any more assemblies, let's just work. But we didn't, and it just happened in a certain way that people started to feel like they want to be part of it, but through the relationships, I think. We started to build, again, relationships. Nova Cvernovka went through very hard times after the COVID, then hard times came with with almost the end of our cultural center, and there were quite hard times in the team as well, as with the relationships between people in the building, between the foundation and the people. A lot of old pains and old wounds opened, and and it's very specific, it's not the city, yeah? It's not on the city level, but I think when we said to each other that, okay, let's focus on people that still cares. We need the critical mass, yeah? We need 10 people, we need more Anichkas, yeah, sitting here, and Yankas, and so on. And, and we started to build relations, and I think that's why people came. And also, I think we started to work on some promises that we made before. You know, people just are very, very sensible to something you say. You promise that, yeah, we will do the road, yeah, we will build the beautiful garden and so on. And then 1 year comes, second year, third year, no, nothing changes. And I think the trust can, like, yeah, it's like this the smell of something that people has around. And yeah, therefore relationship through building the trust again. Yeah, I'm back with the trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, getting to the root issue of where the concerns are coming from. So if we even take a step back from that, and it's like, for us, often it's like, how do you even get a space that you can use? So if I take the Garden Square example from the pavilion, and we were wanting to work with landowners about opening up these garden squares, and immediately they're like, no, why would we do that? And trying to get to the root cause of their concern of doing that, which was often around antisocial behaviour, for example, and then working with them to say, well, let's test doing that for a day or two, a year or a month, and see what happens. And suddenly they start to see by testing it that actually antisocial behaviour isn't such a big problem, and it's really useful to have more passers-by and people there, and it starts to create a more vibrant kind of space around their garden square. So I think often it's getting to the root issues and really understanding where the concerns are coming from. And often they might also be legitimate concerns. So with a public kitchen, for example, there were legitimate concerns at first about having benches that would be used for antisocial behaviour as well. So therefore, how do we design those benches that alleviate those concerns of littering and things like that? And then also trying to align visions, I think. So taking that step back to be like, yes, you may be from very different kind of stances and standpoints here where you're kind of set up against one another, but let's see what we actually have in common. Let's see actually what it is we all want to achieve with that bigger vision. It may be through a different route that we're imagining to get there, but actually we've got more in common than we first think. And I think taking the time to do that could be really valuable in setting up that kind of common goal.
And that sort of takes time, and those people to be together in the room or in the space and have that, to find those commonalities. And we're finding that with this space here, this is what's happening, and this is what gives me so much joy to see how we are, through different formats, bringing people together. We recently started a series of round tables around the new metropolitan plan, and we've got people sitting at, like 5 tables in the room, and at each table we have a mix. We have somebody from the chief architect's office, we have a developer, we have the government officials, we have people from our institute, we have experts in different sort of architecture, urban planning, ecology, and so on. And it's really interesting to see how, once those conversations get started, once those people are in the room that they normally don't naturally meet, because the planning authority is giving out statements, and it's kind of like this very opaque space or place, and somebody sends in their project and proposal, and then something comes back after quite a long time, and then there's a list of things that don't work or are not acceptable, and having an understanding of why, what is the expectations, what are the expectations, how can we make that process more transparent, more clear, and then it can move a little bit faster, but we have to put in the work, the participatory work, to get to the place where it's gonna move faster, be more transparent, be, safeguarding the public value. Have we got any questions from the audience now? Anyone? Okay, well, we can keep on. There's one from Kalka in the first row. There you go.
I was waiting whether somebody will raise up their hand. So thank you for all the stories and examples that what everything you have done. I'm not sure that I will be able to explain what I would like to comment on. When I was listening to you, Hannah and Patty, so I think that there was a lot of community organizing or community development or social change movement, or the things which are present at bottom-up approach. And I was surprised that you mentioned that for the first year you were not allowed or you were not wanting to do anything to intervene. So maybe I just didn't get it properly. So, when you mentioned Metropolitan Institute from Prague, IPER, so it's for me like a top-down approach more, where it's very legitimate to decide some things, and the team of people who are doing participation, they are facilitators who are just listening, are very sensitive to observing and listening, and there can be decision makers who can put on the table everything what they want to decide, and they are setting the framework. So there is no one participation. So there are various approaches.
And the question?
Sorry, what was the question then?
My option was that it's just a committee of observation.
That there are different ways of participation. Yes, of course. I mean, we've talked a lot about the bottom up, but actually, I think it doesn't work. In time, people get tired and they might feel exploited, or they just simply don't have the time and resources to participate endlessly if there's no change. Or, we talked about trust, so there's a promise to make a change, and then you have to deliver on the promise. Otherwise, you're losing the trust. And I think we are here in a space where the trust in institutions in our country is very low. It's one of the lowest in Europe. This is a very particular situation. I mean, it really affects everything that we're trying to do when we're talking about metropolitan plan. It's a very complex thing where we have to get consensus of many different stakeholders, but even at the scale of a public square, the complexity is the same almost, You always have complexity in these different, scales of the universe that Maddie so wonderfully showed us at the beginning in this diagram. So, what can we?
Maybe I can. I don't see the answer to that, but maybe the food for thought. And that food for thought is that if we are really so bottom up, and if there are so many differences between being the foundation or institution running the big place, and the city, and I think the commonality is that sometimes we also had a feeling that there are experts that should design the campus and the space, the Nova Cvernovka. We also sometimes had a feeling that we are the ones that has a responsibility for the place. That's why we have to decide rightly, and who are those people that doesn't understand, And I think like there are similarities mostly in the attitudes or things how you do the stuff. And maybe what both of us can change is that ask ourselves that who are the experts here, because also like now I will be the devil's advocate, is that I came here to Tuba and I don't feel like I want to be here because it's so light, there are people with their fancy notebooks all around, there is this very expensive cake, it's not very, it's not very open, like, to be honest, just look around, it's the space for certain people with certain taste. And sometimes we have this feeling that we know better if we have this tag of the urbanists, for me, like executive director, blah, 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 blah. And actually, what is interesting in social theory, it's Latourian agency, like who is an agency, really, are not experts, are people that are part of the system, and not only the people, it can be also animals, it can be also the space itself. That's the deep sociology there. But when we think about it, that the expert can be everyone, every tenant can be the expert of their own everyday reality. Every children visiting Nova Cvernovka is the expert of their own reality. Then the attitude or your way around changes, if you see them as an expert, not yourself. And this is something that maybe it's
very big topic you opened there.
I'm sorry for the cakes.
No, the experts. No, I'm not. Let's not discuss the cakes, but the experts and in co-design, and maybe I'll pass this on to Maddie now. you know who's actually the designer in the co-design process, because at the same time, and this is my belief, is that you know there is the value of the experts, and you mentioned the different experts with different expertise, like a broadcaster that you needed or a filmmaker, because the advocacy and pushing that on to governance, you know, the more people you can get. So I think sometimes this is a thin line, because I don't think that we should even ask people to design their city themselves entirely. I mean, it's like too much to put on them, like people have jobs and families and so on. But I agree with Hannah's point about them being experts of their personal experience, their day-to-day life and their needs and what could be improved, and that the experts should be listening. And sometimes even before listening or asking questions, because if you ask a question, there's, you know, the questions can be very leading. They could be trying to get the answer that you want. So I find in placemaking and in practice, when I was in practice before I took on this role, observing is also like really important, because you observe how people behave in a space and the patterns and what works, what doesn't work, and before you start asking questions. So who's designing and who's the expert and how does it work?
No, I really agree with this, because also your point about the questions you actually ask, like often if you ask people what they want to see in a space, they'll tell you what they already know. And you're trying to get to the bottom of actually what could we do that no one had even imagined, which might help us in our city. And I often feel like the most valuable place for the co-design process actually is in the briefing part of the process, which is often overlooked and kind of skipped. But that's almost the place that's most important to get community kind of involved in, to really understand what the issues are, what the brief of the place should be. And then I feel like my job as a designer or architect is to translate the ideas that come out of workshops into a cohesive design. Because I think if you leave people who haven't had any design training to design a city around them, like Petra says, first of all, that's quite exploitative, but secondly, you sort of would end up with this chaos of lots of different ideas. And I do think there comes a point where it's important to have a kind of cohesive kind of vision, and I think there's certain training that people have from different disciplines, but all too often, firstly, those disciplines are set up against each other, then experts and citizens are set up against one another, and it's about how can we sort of all come together to use our skills. Like, no one knows a place like the people who live there, so how do we use that as a skill that can be embedded within the process that's often overlooked? How do we use lived experience, which is often completely overlooked? And how do we sort of respect the expertise that we all can bring?
Hannah, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just want to be demolisher again, because I think, and just to answer your question also with the conflicts, I think the most common common situation when the conflicts began is that when we stand in front of each other and we talk from each other from certain positions. And if I come to someone and say, I'm an expert here, it doesn't mean that I can mean it right. I can be very nice architect, okay? I can be very nice co-designer, but right away I'm creating the wall between me and the citizen. We used it in this discussion too many times, you know, us and them again. And that's what I was just more pointing out, is that sometimes we have to come as a normal people and talk as a normal people to normal people without giving us the decks. And then maybe that conversation or magic can happen, and to get down somehow.
We had an interesting example in the autumn in one of the CityMakers series actually, where someone was here who talked about participation, where it was quite a difficult one, where there was a new development and an existing community, and they had done the first participation meeting where nobody knew who the developer is, and the developer was in the room just as a person. Actually was quite a young guy, sort of just, you know, people didn't assume, and it was not like to trick people and say like, oh well, now that's him, you know, at the end, but it was a way to for this person to listen to the people without having that, what you just mentioned, like, okay, I'm the developer and I'm going to build this new project next door to you, and it immediately, you know, people would be maybe, you know, feeling very differently about sharing their thoughts and so on. So I think we have time for one last question, if anyone, there's one at the back, please, if we can get the microphone there. So you've not been asking a lot tonight, but you're all still sitting here, so I assume you've been enjoying the conversation, and your question, please.
So thank you for the interesting thoughts and discussion. And my question is regarding the financing system. Like we've seen today in Slovakia, where we cannot really rely on the state for financing with the FEU fund, like the fund for supporting arts, that just crushed the financing that was already approved. So if you are thinking, or what are you thinking about some other alternatives to finance these projects, participation?
So that's quite a big topic of financing arts and culture, and the value of art, I suppose, arts and culture in actually making cities better, more approachable, more inclusive, and so on. So maybe briefly, Hannah, I mean, this is quite a difficult situation for Nova Cvenovka at the moment, but we've heard also from Maddie in one of her projects, it took quite a long time to realize it, and you were doing it incrementally in very tiny phases, and and that's community kitchen project. I mean, it wasn't like a huge investment that was needed, so it's incredibly difficult. And when you show the map of all the stakeholders and on all the organizations that you had to bring along in order to realize what was like really small interventions with big impact for those people. So I mean, what does it tell us about how governments or administration sort of value this type of work and its impact and value for the communities?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about the FPO today, but I can say that I don't care about them. Like, let's be honest, like, we have to survive without the state. Like, that's the first step that everyone in the room that works in the culture, civic society, NGOs and so on, we have to change the perspective and say to ourselves, we don't need you. Because now, let's go to the core of the participation. I think it's action. It's not talking, it's not creating the documents, it's action. And when you have people motivated enough to change their spaces around them, you give them the tools. It doesn't have to be money, it doesn't have to be the workshop, you just give them the space, they will do it. And I think Nova Cvernovka is in a way the showcase of that. When people get angry or when they get motivated, they will just do the stuff. And it happened several years ago, and I think we were somehow waiting for this kind of a new wave of fighting back by us doing something without money, you know. And now I'm just being, you know, very powerful because it just happened today that everything fell apart. But I think we have to remind ourselves this, and if we're from any kind of other civic society, I think we have to just fight with the action and with the people around you. We have our hands and minds.
I think it's really true, like, by showing what can happen, then you can bring more people along. I think it's a really difficult conversation, though, this one about money, and it's almost one maybe for a whole nother discussion, because it is really important that these projects are invested, that people like you are paid, you know, that there has to be money somewhere coming in. And even like a public kitchen, like you say, it was so small, the amounts of funding we needed. But what we found was once we got small amounts, we could start doing match funding. But all of that took so much time and energy to get on board just for these small amounts. And even with the British Pavilion, you know, the amount of time that we had to take just to try and get people to fund it, coming back to the UK to go on to other places, because you need to pay people to, you know, reinstall, you know, and things like that. And yeah, I think a lot of the way perhaps is to not rely on the state so much and to look at how you can get other people as well to provide that funding. I don't have a one-line kind of answer to you, unfortunately. I mean, for us, it was approaching developers, it was approaching all sorts of different people with who have a different kind of thing they want out of a project. But it's a very difficult and important conversation. But I think, like you say as well, if you can prove, I think what you've proven hopefully then gets other people as well to understand the importance of investing in it.
Thank you. I mean, we've opened really big topics, and I hope that some of you will go on discussing them informally over a piece of cake, perhaps. And action, motivation, trust, and I think trust is really the one that's so important for us, and democracy. So a round of applause for our lovely guest tonight, for Madeleine Kessler and And thanks again for everyone for coming tonight. And as mentioned at the beginning, you've got the leaflets with the feedback forms. So we really want you to tell us anything and everything, positive, negative, what can be better. And thank you so much for joining us again. And watch out for the next program, which is on tuba.mib.sk. Thank you. Bye-bye and have a good night.